Hi there, U.S. History kids. Today and tomorrow we will be working on an assignment called Road to Secession Chart, Causes of the Civil War. This is already on Schoology. If you want to print it out so that it's a little bit easier to follow through and fill in, you can. Or you can just open up the doc and fill it out. There's a lot of complexity to the reasons for the Civil War, and the Civil War itself has so much information. You could literally do a class just on that topic, okay? So it may seem like a lot, but I'm going to simplify a lot of the information for you. We're going to do the first four today, which involve Uncle Tom's Cabin, Compromise of 1850, Kansas-Nebraska Act, and the Fugitive Slave Act. And then the next four we'll do tomorrow. Okay, so I did just send you out your slides for this lesson. So it's called Civil War Part 1. Or you can just watch this video to get your answers, okay? So, again, I just sent those to you, but let me pull it up on Google and we'll go over these together. So you have two parts to complete. One, what was the cause? So what happened? And how did it help to lead to the Civil War? Okay. So let's open this up. Boy, I sure hope you can see this, hopefully. Okay. Causes of the Civil War, Part 1. We're just taking notes, okay? You don't need to write anything down. This is just kind of setting us up. So major differences that we find between the North and the South at this time. We see lots of factories, businesses, textile industries in the North, okay? Highly urbanized, a lot of cities. People are moving from the rural areas into towns. In the South, it's a lot more farm-based. Plantations, slavery is being practiced, right? And we're looking at the outskirts of these cities. North being very highly industrialized, has railroads at this point, large industries and companies that are trying to create transcontinental railroads. Meanwhile, the South is considered, more dirt road type areas of travel and means. Remember that the North consists of free states, so they do not practice or support slavery, and then the Southern states do support slavery. And so slavery is going to be like the main culprit or reason for the Civil War, but there are several different reasons that kind of lead into this. The first cause on our chart here is Uncle Tom's Cabin. I know I mentioned this in a previous set of slides and YouTube video. So this is a book that was created by a white woman called Harriet Beecher Stowe. It was published almost 10 years before the Civil War in 1852, and she writes a fictional story but very true possibilities of what slavery was like in the South. So detailed lives of slaves on the plantations were being exposed, and it's considered a very popular book at this time. In fact, it was considered one of the best-selling novels of the 19th century. The Bible being the top seller, Uncle Tom's Cabin was the second seller for the century, the 1800s. So very popular book. In fact, it was so popular that Abraham Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe in 1860 and, quote, said, "This is the little lady who started the Great War." But again, it talks about some main characters, one of them being a slave owner called Simon Legree, who just treats these slaves horribly, beats them to death. And so this causes a great social and political outrage by all of those who have read it or do read it. And so a lot of the North was like, we cannot be practicing slavery. It will, ruin the institution of America itself. And so we do not stand behind slavery. This book also kept England from supporting the South during the Civil War. So remember that the cotton industry was not only supported by the North, but it was supported by England. Once this book comes out, England starts to withdraw their support in economically supporting the South. And that's huge. So they're going to lose a lot of economic profits from England because of this book. Of course, looking at different perspectives here, the South says, you know, this book is inaccurate, it's untrue, and that farms treated the slaves as family. It's very interesting. Again, we talked about this before, like reasons why people would support slavery. There was this very skewed mentality of, you know, I'm going to father these slaves and take care of them and civilize them. And that was a common belief at the time. So write in what the Uncle Tom's Cabin was and how it leads to the Civil War. So how it leads into the Civil War, it causes a lot of outrage for people all over the world, honestly, and creates that deeper division between those that do and those that don't support slavery. Okay, moving on. This isn't on your chart, but it will lead into the Compromise of 1850. So remember that we first had the Missouri Compromise when we looked at states being admitted into the Union. So they wanted to create this balance between free and slave states. So think of like a teeter-totter or a seesaw, right? So they said all new states north of the 3630 line would come in as slave states, or sorry, free states. All other states would be slave. So to create that continuous balance between free and slave, Missouri will come in as a slave state, Maine comes in as a free state. So as much as the senators and congressmen are trying to create a balance, what they're ultimately doing is creating an even deeper division. Okay, Compromise of 1850 is our second cause. This is proposed by the statesman known as Henry Clay. Henry Clay was considered the great compromiser in regards to slavery. He was a statesman of Kentucky and actually tried to run for presidency 3 times and lost 3 times. But here's what the compromise was composed of. California, because we just gained California from an agreement with Mexico. California comes in as a free state. New Mexico and Utah can decide whether or not they want to be free or slave. No more auctions in DC. I think the other parts I forgot to include here. So number 4 being that slavery still existed in DC. And then number 5 will be the Fugitive Slave Act. Okay, so those are all the conditions of the Compromise of 1850. So think about how that might lead into or cause the Civil War. Well, one, we're giving states the opportunity to decide whether or not they're free or slave. And a lot of Northerners were like, no, that shouldn't even be an option. We're trying to get slavery to be abolished or removed altogether. So even though these sound like compromises, it's going to create even more of a conflict between North and South states. Okay, so John C. Calhoun was a statesman of South Carolina. He was very pro-slavery and he opposed the Compromise of 1850. He said that we shouldn't be deciding as a federal government whether states are free or slave, that states have rights to get rid of acts of the federal government and they're allowed to leave the union if they want. Like they can make their own decisions. And so ultimately when we get there, John C. Calhoun will be the one to promote what's called secession or formally withdrawing from the Union or the United States. So he believed that ending slavery was considered morally wrong as it interfered with the right to own property, and, you know, the economic benefits that came from it. I would also like to argue, though, that he probably said a lot of these things, too, because of his practice, very active practice of white supremacy. Okay, so that's number 2. We're skipping to 4 real quick just because I want to put them in order. So then we go down to the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. So this is an act that was created that said all citizens of the U.S. would be required to assist in capturing and returning escaped slaves. So this is the South's attempt to bring back the property that they felt that they owned, right? So this was first enacted in 1793, and there's more acts that kind of lead up to this one. But these are essentially bounties that are put on people's head and considered like an offer to have these slaves be captured and returned to their owners. So that is highly controversial because there will be people that were free blacks that were then enslaved. No slaves had any legal protection in this, so people were being kidnapped and captured. They had no say in this enactment of this law. And because of this law itself, truly, the Underground Railroad would be at its peak. So it becomes very popular. But we'll talk much more about the abolition movement next week. So who are free blacks, or what are they? Free blacks are freedmen, those that earned their freedom. They lived in both the North and the South. Living in the South as a freedman was very dangerous, though, so you would commonly see them in the North. Or they were also African Americans who were born free. They were able to own properties of land. They were able to participate and have jobs in society. They were able to serve in the military. Again, these being more of the northern states that allowed all these privileges and opportunities. But again, free blacks could be sold into slavery due to the Fugitive Slave Act. The 12 Years a Slave owner or writer that we read about last week, Solomon Northup, is a perfect example of somebody who was a freedman, but who was then captured and enslaved for 12 years. So that's huge, right? And they had no legal protection. So how many free blacks were there? By 1860, leading right up to the Civil War, there were approximately 448,000 free blacks living in the United States. Okay. Because of the Fugitive Slave Act, again, the safe homes of the Underground Railroad will be organized. Okay, last one. So first off, why did the Fugitive Slave Act create the cause the Civil War? I mean, think about it. You have Southern slave owners and politicians that want to recapture what they think is their property. But ultimately, the North and the abolition movement disagreed with that act. So that, again, is going to cause conflict. Here's our last one for the day, which is the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Okay, this is an act proposed by a politician called Stephen Douglas. We'll learn more about him next week. Stephen Douglas ran for presidency up against Abraham Lincoln and then obviously loses. But Kansas and Nebraska wanted to be admitted as states to the United States, and Douglas proposed that this should be able to happen because these states could be obviously created, and then the Transcontinental Railroad could continue on through these states. This act supported allowing Kansas and Nebraska to choose for themselves whether or not they wanted to be slave or free. This idea is called popular sovereignty, or the right to self-rule. But here's the issue. Northerners formed a Republican Party as a response to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. They disagreed with this act because it was still allowing for the power and opportunity and privilege of the South to hold and practice slavery. So the Republican Party, newly created at this time, so remember we had Andrew Jackson create our Democratic Party. We now have Douglas and Abraham Lincoln that will help promote this new party called the Republican Party, and it came due to the Fugitive Slave Act and Kansas-Nebraska Act. They did not agree with these acts. They wanted them repealed or removed. Okay? So those are our first 4 reasons. Fill out what they are, fill out why they caused conflict that led to the Civil War. If after watching this video and reading through the slides, you're still confused about what to write, just message me. Or remember that I do have open tutoring tomorrow from 10 to 12.